This talk will focus upon the abuse of elderly and disabled persons in families, and will also spend a few moments with some comments regarding special considerations in working with Alaska Native elderly persons. The whole issue about elder abuse is really something that remained under the surface for the most part until the 1980s, as you can see here. By the end of that decade, most states had enacted some form of mandatory elder abuse reporting law, similar to the child abuse reporting laws that exist around the nation. We'll talk about Alaska's reporting law later in this discussion. Elder abuse is recognized now as a social problem as the population of elders continues to grow with the retirement of the baby boomer generation, and it is expected that by 2030 some 71.5 million persons in the United States will be able to be defined as elderly. There are different definitions of what constitutes elder abuse. The American Psychological Association refers to elder abuse as the infliction of physical, emotional, or psychological harm on an older adult. Elder abuse can take the form of financial exploitation or intentional or unintentional neglect of an older adult by the caregiver. The Center for Disease Control defines elder abuse as an intentional act or failure to act by a caregiver or another person in a relationship involving an expectation of trust that causes or creates a risk of harm to an older adult. And here the older adult is referred to as someone aged 60 or older. The definitions of elder abuse are problematic more so than in many other areas of family violence because they encompass more subtypes of abuse and types of abuse that are difficult to really operationalize. The CDC defines elder abuse as primarily focused upon 5 areas, as you see here: physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional or psychological abuse, neglect, and financial abuse or exploitation. The other forms of elder abuse that are identified below, self-neglect, abandonment, violation of human rights, and scams, can most likely be subsumed into the 5 areas defined by the CDC as constituting elder abuse. One big difference here in regards to abuse as opposed to other populations is the focus upon financial abuse or exploitation. And in fact, this is one of the larger areas of elder abuse, as you'll see. But because of the fact that oftentimes they are dependent upon others to tend to these matters, they are easy to be taken advantage of. In a 2008 study, verbal abuse was the most common form of elder maltreatment. And this was followed by financial exploitation and then physical abuse. While sexual abuse as a form of elder abuse is relatively rare, it did occur and is usually, if it does occur, perpetrated by a spouse or intimate partner. Here we're focusing primarily upon abuse in intimate partner relationships. And so, by and large, we're not talking about nursing home relationships or professionals who are working with individuals, although we will be talking about them briefly later on in this discussion. But for the purposes of most of this discussion, we're concentrating upon intimate partner relationships. And this includes not only the intimate partners, but also relatives, children, and grandchildren, and those other individuals who are living with the elderly person. There's a list of conditions here which can be considered correlates of elder abuse, but not necessarily causes. And so you oftentimes will see such things as isolation or low socioeconomic status, lack of housing, those kinds of things as being connected to incidents of elder abuse, but really should not be considered causes of the abuse itself. Revictimization studies also show that the elders who were abused as children or traumatized in other ways tend to be more vulnerable to abuse later in life. There are different areas in our society, let's say different viewpoints in our society, that promote the existence of elder abuse, and these are listed here as ageism, sexism, attitudes in support of violence in our society. And this, of course, means not necessarily that people support violence, but that there's an acceptance of violence in American society these days. The minimalizing, denying, ignoring that goes on in reactions to elder abuse, negative attitudes about persons with capabilities, and also the imperatives that individuals within a family take care of each other, so that at times when a middle-aged person, for instance, is faced with an older relative who is losing his or her faculties, there's a focus placed upon that individual caring for that person rather than having that disabled person being placed in an institution or an assisted living facility. This oftentimes creates a lot of stress and sets up elder abuse later, something we'll touch on in a later discussion. When elder abuse does occur, those victims may not want to disclose, and it may have to do with the stigma of abuse, or not even really realizing that what's going on in his or her life is abusive. The elder person may be afraid of not being believed by other people, also may fear of losing the care of the persons who are abusing them if their possibilities are limited. If they want to stay in their own home, sometimes they're really willing to put up with difficulties in their relationship in order to stay in their own home. Individuals that are older may have mental incapacity going on in their lives. They may feel guilty, feeling as though they're the cause of the children's behavior if the children are abusing them. They may be worried about institutionalizing, and they may just want to protect their own privacy. In dealing with elders, oftentimes they may not be cooperative in any investigation you might do or be willing to talk about what's happening in their lives. There was an article written by 3 different professors from the University of Alaska and published in 2007. And these individuals came from a mix of professional backgrounds and disciplines. And so it was written, I think, primarily for health professionals going into the villages. And I would think that social workers can be considered professional healthcare representatives also. And so this is something that I thought was very useful for the purposes of this discussion. Alaska Native elders often refer to abuse as a lack of respect, and so the term of abuse may be offensive to elders and makes it more difficult for them to talk about, and so they tend to want to talk about these things as respect and disrespect. And emotional disrespect may be one of the most common types of disrespect that are mentioned by them. The elderly are reluctant to report abuse. This has something to do with what we were just talking about in all populations, but for elders, there's a reluctance to report abuse by a family member to law enforcement for fear of compromising the longevity of their group, a possible outbreak of suicide among at-risk youth, and also the withholding of financial or personal support by that individual. The elderly believe that they're disrespected by non-natives, and this involves the disrespect of lifestyles and traditions by non-natives who come into their communities. Some elders reported to those conducting this study that healthcare professionals treat them in a disrespectful manner by assuming that they don't understand their own bodies. The elderly perceive a loss of respect by some younger Alaska Natives. These younger Natives adopt non-native ways, and the traditions that protected Alaska Natives in the past become threatened because of that process. The elders report a belief that Native youth sometimes don't value their traditional wisdom and therefore treat them as though they lack intelligence. The emotional needs of the elderly are sometimes neglected by families and service agencies. Nursing staff and family members ignore elderly Alaska Natives' physical and emotional needs, as reported by these elders during this study. Those elders also express concern about the emotional abuse caused by families who place their elderly in extended care facilities and then don't visit them. This is in part caused by the distance involved and the difficulty in transportation in rural areas of Alaska where these facilities are placed and so on. There's quite a bit of expense involved in going back and forth, and this is something that is experienced as neglectful and abusive by the elders, understandably. When caregivers, family members, and friends either consciously or unconsciously communicate to the elderly that they're a burden, they become emotionally injured. It's also important to note that the elderly are overburdened with caregiving responsibilities in Alaska Native culture. Elderly Native Alaskans oftentimes provide full-time care for their grandchildren and great-grandchildren, while the parents are unavailable due to substance abuse or lack of parenting skills. There is a common intergenerational practice for extended family members among Alaska Native communities to care for young children for short periods of time, but these traditional arrangements for short-term care appear to be expanding to involve extensive caregiving responsibilities over longer periods of time. And when the elderly are overburdened with caring for youth, they may experience physical, emotional, and financial strain. Elderly Alaska Natives also experience financial exploitation. Financial abuse of Alaska Native elderly by family members was the most frequently mentioned form of disrespect. They are at risk for financial disrespect from those in control of their finances, not unlike those who are in control of elderly finances in other cultures as well. But the family members may take advantage of the elderly in Alaska Native culture who depend on the younger generation to care for them. So these are some considerations that were mentioned in this particular study. And it's available in a brief article called Interpreting Elder Abuse Among Alaska Natives, and you'll find it on the web if you went looking for it. As practitioners obtain greater understanding of the precursors of elder abuse, then they should be able to protect potential victims more readily. Here are some risk factors that were identified in another publication that I made use of in the past, with victim characteristics and perpetrator characteristics that are oftentimes present before abuse occurs or as abuse is beginning to occur in these relationships. Of course, you see one of the things common with both groups are dependence on the other person, dependence on the abuser, or dependence on the victim. And this sometimes sets up this dynamic that can be very, very unhealthy, particularly if you're involving adult children who aren't able to break free or who are feeling burdened by the need to care for their elderly relative. Of course, they share the shared living situation as another particular problem. Batterer's intervention we'll be talking about in a few weeks in relation to interpersonal violence, but generally speaking, Batterer's intervention programs aren't very effective in treating this particular population of abusers because their needs are very different from those of younger batterers and batterers in other types of situations. Some of the characteristics of the elders who are abused primarily tend to be female, whether the victim is a parent or a spouse, although males certainly are also subject to elder abuse. Poor health can be a risk factor, as can cognitive impairment, including dementia and Alzheimer's disease. Those not living with a spouse or other intimate partner are more likely to be experiencing some form of abuse. And this kind of touches into the areas of moving into institutions and assisted living facilities, but also could be involving adult children as well. Adults often wish to remain in their own homes and as they get older, and this is one reason why they're oftentimes reluctant to seek outside assistance when their caretaker becomes abusive of them. One study estimated that 1 in 25 cases of elder abuse are ever reported to the authorities. And even when reported to the police or Adult Protective Services, the report may not be formally investigated. The Adult Protective Services arrangement, as far as I can tell, as it exists in Alaska at the present time, primarily focuses upon one office in Anchorage that has a small number of workers. And as reports come into the APS office there, they oftentimes connect with community partners to make a contact with the family and essentially do their investigation for them now. And in more severe cases of reported abuse or neglect, my understanding is APS workers travel to the communities. This is, again, what was going on some years ago, and I'm thinking it's still the same today. But for less severe reports, I believe they have tended to rely upon the community partner agencies to look into these situations and report back to them. Probably less than effective, and this is something that Alaska might want to take a look at. Years ago, Adult Protective Services was handled by the Division of Family and Youth Services, now called the Office of Children's Services, but Adult Protective Services was removed from their oversight back in the 1990s, as I recall. If abuse is confirmed in an investigation and the adult is living in their own home, sometimes the outcomes are unpleasant for everyone. The elderly person might be forced to move into assisted living facility or some other form of institutionalized care. Or, as an alternative, they may have their own legal and financial rights removed and be appointed a guardian to take care of them and watch over their situation. This sometimes is something that the elderly person is very reluctant to permit to happen. In the end, during an investigation, the abused adult may not confirm maltreatment, even if it is occurring, for these and other reasons. What is it that motivates the persons who abuse the elderly person? What are the underlying causes? And there are different theories and ideas about that. One social learning theory suggests that an abused child sometimes may grow up to abuse their parents as they get older, particularly when that parent becomes more frail and becomes dependent upon them. So having grown up in that violence, basically, they've learned to interact with adults in their life in this particular manner and go on to abuse their elderly parents. Such maltreatment of parents can begin when children are young or as adolescents, as an early warning sign perhaps. This is something that could continue well into the period of time when they move into a caretaking role as an adult. If you look at this from a social exchange theory perspective, assuming the care of elderly has a number of costs, not necessarily financial, but also emotional and social and personal, sometimes assuming the care of the elderly lacks that payoff in those relationships. There is an imbalance in the give and take in the social exchange, and this may lead to abuse. Stress and dependency theories suggest caregivers have what's sometimes called a 36-hour day, or they're a part of what is known as the sandwich generation, where they're taking care of their children and responsible for running their own home, but also must now take care of the elderly person who is no longer able to care for himself or herself. Sometimes the family decides who's going to be the caregiver, and it's usually focused upon one adult child. It isn't something that, for whatever reason, the adult children want to share evenly. This one child in particular seems to be the person who's selected by the family to care for the elderly person, and it creates a responsibility that sometimes that individual isn't prepared to take. How burdensome is caregiving? That's the question here, and this is the caregiver stress risk factor theory of abuse. The dependency of abused elders is a predisposing factor for abuse. That's another part of this theory because it explains the abuse going on. And then mental health and personality factors of caregivers also add to this concerns as risk factors for the abuse of elders. Now there are some problems with this particular model because there certainly is an element of blaming the victim in this caregiver stress model, the idea that the stress arises from the strain of caregiving and caring for the dependent person rather than arising from the caregiver's behavior and way of dealing with those stresses. This is something that we want to be careful about. If we do identify this as a reason for abuse, be sure that we're not blaming the victim for the abuse in these situations. Certainly, caregiving can be a very difficult process, and we'll be talking a little bit later on about some things that one might be able to do to help relieve some of that stress. And it can be a positive experience for most family caregivers. The positives in doing this outweigh the negatives, but obviously in a situation where elder abuse enters into the picture, it's the other way around. But as far as the elderly's behavior is concerned, when the elderly person becomes violent against that caretaker, this is one of the strongest predictors of a nursing home placement. And that probably is not surprising. There are some theories that abusers are mentally ill, and some differences of opinion about how important this is. Other textbooks like the Barnett text that I have made reference to frequently in these talks, she and her associates say that most abusers are not mentally ill, but Fries and her co-authors indicates that many abusers have been found to have mental illness of some type. So you decide for yourself how important it is, but it is a false belief that the mentally ill are more violent than the general population, and that's something that is nurtured along by our leadership. For instance, every time that there is a mass shooting, rather than looking at some of the social issues involving violence in our society or the ready availability of the purchase of guns for individuals, rather than looking at that as a solution to the issue for mass violence, oftentimes they talk about the need for more mental health services. And it's also interesting that we don't get more mental health services anyway that connects mental illness with violence. And generally speaking, the mentally ill person is no more likely to be violent than the person in the general population. And so that's something important to keep in mind. And it's probably one reason why Barnett et al. Say this is not about mental illness. Fries, though, will tell us that those who do have mental health issues and become abusive are more likely to be living with the older person being abused. We talked about that earlier, that sharing of their living environment. They're often unemployed, which makes them financially dependent upon the older person. Again, refer back to that list of risk factors, I suppose, that we looked at earlier. And also sometimes have fewer friends, so their social contacts are limited, perhaps because of the responsibilities they have, or just perhaps because that's the way their life is. If there is alcohol and drug abuse among the mentally ill who are caregivers, then this also increases the risk of assault. Elder abusers have a comparatively high rate of criminality. Again, they're not all criminals, but compared to the general population, they have a higher rate. Also, another thing to keep in mind is the abuse sometimes may be perpetrated by a violent partner. This is an individual who may be continuing the patterns of battering that was established in a relationship earlier years. in their relationship, or coincidentally kind of reversing the earlier patterns of IPV where the former abuser becomes dependent upon the survivor and the survivor exercises his or her authority abusively, sort of in compensation for the years of abuse previously. Fries indicates that the majority of maltreatment of older adults isn't done by a family member while they reside in nursing homes and other institutions. This particular text doesn't really talk about nursing home abuse. We're going to touch on this, but generally speaking, when older adults are living in nursing homes or institutional settings, the abuse that they experience tend to be at hands of staff. But within the home, when they're living in the home, abuses are equally divided between adult children and intimate partners, their spouses or their other intimate partners. Other family members, not only intimate partners, but also adult children, are primarily the abusers within the home. And the gender of the abuser tends to depend upon the type of abuse. Statistically speaking, at least, sons are more physically abusive than daughters, but daughters are more neglectful than sons. At least some of the studies suggest this. The consequences of abuse for the elderly person and neglect of the elderly person are really very severe and destroys the quality of life, and in fact can be fatal. Older persons, for one thing, they have to keep in mind, they're more physically more vulnerable to injuries from any type of assault. Frail older person may be injured more severely than younger adults when they are the subject or the object of an assault by another person. Problems like PTSD, other health issues, depression, anxiety are 200 to 700 times more likely for abused elders than among the general population of elders. So these are areas that are a particular concern for these individuals. Older adults who lack financial resources or have cognitive impairments are more likely to self-neglect. Self-neglect was referred to earlier, where they don't have an adult, someone else living in the home with them, but they're really not taking care of their own needs in one way or another, and lacking financial resources and cognitive impairments tend to be the reasons for this. Malnutrition and dental disease, not surprising really, are two consequences of the neglect of elders. It's interesting to note that even for elders that have health insurance, many of them do not have dental insurance, and the cost of dentistry is very expensive, and so all sorts of physical problems can grow from dental problems. So this is another area that is of concern for elders with financial difficulties. Also, as mentioned earlier, verbal abuse is perhaps one of the largest areas of abuse of elders, and the addition of verbal abuse resulted in a greater decline in mental health status than physical abuse alone. Just a few comments about demographics. The lower levels of neglect are found for those who identify as Hispanic. The text suggests that this has something to do with the focus upon the strength of the family system in Latino populations. I think that value is something that is shared by many other cultures as well, though. Being African American was found to be a significant predictor of financial exploitation, and also psychological abuse was found to be more common among older African Americans than other groups in one study, at least about 10 years or so ago. Also, older white men have the highest rates of suicide among all groups within the United States, and the risk of suicide is not something that we tend to think of with older persons very often, but I believe it's actually older men over 85 actually have an extremely high rate of suicide compared to the general population. So when we're interacting with elders, we should be asking some basic screening questions. Simply put, are you afraid of anyone? It's a good question to ask. Again, referring back to what we talked about earlier, we may not get a straight answer for a variety of good reasons, but it's a question we should ask. And we should be watching for the red flags. And I'm not going to read the list to you here. I mean, you can see it for yourself. There are a number of different things that red flags don't mean that they're an indication that abuse is occurring, but they are an indication that you should be looking to see whether or not abuse is occurring. EMS personnel often miss signs of abuse, and if medical people, EMS and otherwise, when they do recognize possible abuse, sometimes they're reluctant to report it because of the outcomes of the reports, as we mentioned earlier, but they should be reported. A few words about abuse in long-term care facilities. This comes from a variety of different sources, and I mentioned one of them below. The National Association of Nursing Home Attorneys provided some of these statistics. The lack of adequate care and the abuse that takes place in America's nursing homes is a national disgrace. As far as sexual abuse is concerned, most of the victims are female, and most of the offenders, when that does occur, tend to be long-term care employees. Some of them have criminal records because there have been inadequate background checks done. The second largest category of offenders is other residents, and some of those include registered sex offenders in nursing homes. So these are things that oftentimes we're not considering. Long-term care facilities lack the funding to hire enough staff, and so they tend to have a very high turnover rate. CNAs provide about 90% of the patient care and are the employees who are most likely to be abused by residents. It's a very difficult job to have. There's no question that better training is needed for all nursing home staff, perhaps most especially CNAs. 90% of the U.S. nursing homes have staff levels too low for adequate care. One nurse's aide may care for up to 30 people, but the ratio of nurse's aides to patients tends to be 1 to 15. But the recommendation from professionals is 1 to 3 during a meal and 1 to 6 during non-meal time. So you can see staffing levels tend to be very poor. For individuals who are working with adults or who are looking at perhaps institutional care for their own frail elder relatives, these are some things that should be looked at very closely. 70% of the surveys of nursing home state surveys miss at least one deficiency, and 15% of the surveys actually miss actual harm and the immediate jeopardies that exist for nursing home residents. The Association of Nursing Home Attorneys say that the rate of elder abuse in nursing homes depends entirely on the individual nursing home, the quality that they uphold, how experienced their staff are, and generally how the nursing home is operated and managed. Other reasons for elderly mistreatment can be attributed to understaffing, inexperienced staff, underpaid staff, poorly supervised and managed staff, shortage of resources, and individual caregiver issues. So you can see here that nursing homes, really the staffing is oftentimes insufficient and pay is very poor, turnover is high. So you can see where problems can develop. A few more comments about working with Alaska Native elders and some tips, I suppose, in terms of working with Alaska Native elders, again from the study that I mentioned earlier. Healthcare workers, and again, I'm including social workers here, encountering elderly Alaska Native patients whom they suspect are suffering abuse oftentimes feel frustrated when attempting to elicit information because their patients avoid eye contact. They don't talk about themselves. They might even deny being in an abusive situation, even though the worker has a very strong suspicion that they're being abused. So we always need to be very careful to look beyond the initial silence displayed by Alaska Native elders when abuse is suspected. And, the particular kinds of things like, lack of eye contact, not talking about themselves, being quiet, and those kinds of things are something that oftentimes are a part of communication patterns with Alaska Natives. So we should become informed about Alaska Native cultural communication practices. We should understand and communicate respect for the protocol, values, and ways of life. If we're not informed about those things, we might unknowingly violate cultural communication practices and disrespect the Native elderly. And this could lead to getting very superficial information or just total silence altogether. We should always begin a visit by asking for advice from the elderly about any appropriate protocols in their community for the situation. And if the client isn't willing to explain the protocols, we might refer you to someone who can explain them. Always a good idea to, if you're entering a Native village, to meet with somebody with the Native tribe that is there in the village, a representative from the tribe, before you go into the village if you can, to talk about these things, particularly if you're unfamiliar with the cultural practices. Allow yourself to be corrected and ask the elderly person to teach you the proper ways of respect. Sometimes offering a small gift might help communicate respect to the elderly client, but I think asking for a direction as to how to show respect is something that in and of itself can be very helpful. Watch your pace of your speech and try to match it to the pace of the patient's speech. Mirroring the cadence of the elderly person is one way to increase communication, show respect, and you're not rushing the elderly that way. So pushing them and rushing them may force them to withdraw from talking with you. And watch for nonverbal communication patterns, because healthcare providers are held in high regard in communities generally. It's oftentimes common for the elderly person not to look directly at the healthcare provider while listening intently to what they're saying. So lack of eye contact And we probably know this already, but lack of eye contact is not an indication of disrespect. That's a peculiarly Western idea. Listen more than talk. Give the elder your total attention. That's a good thing to do in any interaction. Allow the elderly ample time to express themselves without interruptions. When they're silent, they may be showing respect rather than incomprehension or uncooperativeness. And oftentimes, the elderly will speak indirectly in stories and metaphors. When you ask somebody in a village, a smaller village in particular, to implicate a relative in criminal behaviors, you're going to run into a tendency to be very reluctant to do that. They don't always trust us to begin with, non-native interveners, and they may be reluctant to implicate other people, particularly members of their own family, in reports of neglect or abuse that could result in jail time or fines for the perpetrator. And this threatens not only the individual, but may threaten community activities that are key to the existence and day-to-day living of the community. Avoid addressing individual issues and take, as much as possible, a family or community systems approach. So develop and strengthen community networks as much as possible to raise awareness and provide outreach and detection and encouragement to report abuse. Consider engaging village-based elders' councils to organize forums to focus on elder priorities. Healthcare workers going in, particularly those going into smaller communities, but also working with natives in the urban areas, should take the time to learn the values and protocols that are part of the culture of those individuals. Because if we don't have that understanding, our communication may be very incomplete and the quality of our care will be compromised. A few slides about disabled persons. This is not an area that really was addressed specifically in either of the textbooks that I could identify, at least to begin with. And so I just wanted to mention a little bit about this, that persons with disabilities represent about 20% of the population of the United States. And perhaps in some respects, there are a lot of commonalities between the disabled population and the elderly population, but not by any means is that the case in all situations. There just isn't a lot of research data about the abuse of disabled persons available to us, and this reflects what one other author refers to as the invisibility of handicapped persons in our culture. The Census Bureau defines disability as sensory, physical, mental, or emotional conditions that last 6 months or more that make it difficult to perform activities of daily living such as walking, climbing stairs, dressing, bathing, learning, or remembering. Our assumptions about disability prevents employers from providing jobs that disabled people are perfectly capable of doing very effectively and well. The idea being that disabled people can't function in the workplace. Society tends to oppress, devalue, and dehumanize disabled women and men, and that makes them more vulnerable to abuse than others. When we look at the types of abuse for disabled persons, the list is expanded somewhat to include terrorizing behaviors, severe rejection, isolating, ignoring, use of physical or medical restraints, and the withholding of necessary services like toileting, bathing, and feeding. We think that the abuse of disabled persons is underreported. They're more likely to be abused than non-disabled persons. A disabled woman will suffer more abuse than a non-disabled woman and will also suffer more abuse than a disabled man. So disabled women are a particularly vulnerable group in this population. Homeless and severely mentally ill women experience victimization rates as high as 97%. Disabled women suffer abuse longer than non-disabled women, and the sexual assault rate of disabled women is twice that of non-disabled women. We have to figure out one's capacity for consent, and determining that is complicated by legal and ethical issues that vary from location to location, the legal issues at least. And while there's no significant difference in reporting abuse to police, more disabled persons report that police did not respond to their calls. Here again, the perpetrators often include non-relative caregivers and strangers who interact with the person on a regular basis because of their conditions. So these are just some other considerations for individuals that are suffering from disabilities. So policy issues for combating elder abuse. The American Association of Retired Persons in 2007 did a study that found that the courts were not following the usual procedures in elder abuse cases. The judges and court personnel tend to have a need for training in aging and abuse. Also, more attorneys, pro bono attorneys, need to be made available because of the limited financial resources that the elderly often are faced with. Service delivery is fragmented in communities for the elderly population, and communities need to organize those services better to protect the vulnerable elders more effectively. The best way to intervene to respond to this problem appears to be multidisciplinary teams. That is something that, as a social worker, you're going to become very familiar with multidisciplinary teams. No one area, no one specialization, no one profession has all of the answers in almost all of the situations that we interact with individuals on. So get ready to work in teams. One of those teams that can be useful are called death review teams. In child maltreatment, the corollary is the child fatality review team. And these are groups of individuals whenever there's an unintended death or a suspicious death or anything like that. They're unexplained death, I suppose. The team comes together and reviews the medical records. And the intention is to look for systemic problems that led to this person's death. And so this is something that can be useful not only in discovering undetected murders, but also it can be useful in trying to identify gaps in services that might have prevented the death to begin with. Also, there are some communities that establish multidisciplinary teams to help elders deal with financial situations and avoid financial abuse. Alaska does have a mandatory reporting, and I believe all states now have mandatory reporting of elder abuse, just like we do with child abuse. The statute says, this is as of 2020, when a mandated reporter in the performance of their professional duties has reasonable cause to believe that a vulnerable adult suffers from undue influence, abandonment, exploitation, abuse, neglect, or self-neglect, they're required to report, and the obligation is to report to law enforcement, or there is, I believe in Alaska, a reporting hotline, if I read that correctly, also Adult Protective Services, and Anchorage is another place to make these reports. And here you see the list of mandated reporters, and I'm not going to read them off to you. You can see social workers are, of course, in the middle of that list, and really anybody that's interacting with adults who are frail and elderly or disabled individuals on a professional basis, you're required to report a suspect abuse. Of note, this does include caregivers, if you look down that list, caregivers of vulnerable adults in the home, and also educators and administrative staff members of public and private educational institutions. There's hardly anybody left. And finally, just a few thoughts about things we can do to respond to elder abuse of the disabled as well here. Effective interventions might include addressing the social isolation and enhancing the social support of the individual. There are a number of different ways we can go about doing that. Most communities have adult daycare centers, which, just like schools do for children, is one area, particularly if you're concerned about possible abuse, one area where that individual is seen on a regular basis, and people who are trained can keep an eye open for any signs of abuse. But also, it gives the caregiver a respite, and it gives the elderly person or the disabled person's other social interactions that are important for all of us, I think, on a social basis. Home visitors, both professional and personal, friendly visitors, so to speak, as well as professional ones, another area to break that isolation. Community senior centers serve a great purpose for the elderly person. And whenever possible, strengthen the family connections. Obviously, if the abuser is from the family, you want to look for individuals who help guard against that from occurring, but also it might relieve the caregiver of some of their individual responsibilities, which can become very oppressive at times. Provide education about elder abuse at the community level so that the community becomes aware that it does indeed exist. Dispel any myths. Just like with abused spouses, well, the elderly person is free to leave if he or she wants to. Not always the case. And alter our societal attitudes and reduce our tolerance for elder abuse, as referred to earlier in this discussion. Utilize multidisciplinary teams that cover social, medical, legal, educational, whatever area may be necessary. Enhance the effectiveness of adult protective services in your state. And then lastly, provide support for the caregivers. And again, I want to stress that we're not blaming the victim in these situations, but it is something that's very important to realize that caregivers of individuals who are dependent upon others sometimes can be a great burden and is something that can weigh very heavily on the individual who's maybe trying their best to provide good care for that person. And so kinds of support that are available include education, networking possibilities, and also respite care, where the caregiver has an opportunity to get away for a while, whether it's a few hours or a few days, a weekend, and another person comes in and assumes responsibility for helping the frail elderly person. Just different ideas. There are probably better ideas also out there, but these are some ideas that might be useful in responding to elder abuse and in reducing its incidence. That concludes my discussion for this particular topic, and if, as always, there are questions that arise from this, please let me know, and I'd be happy to discuss it further with you. Thank you.